Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about your service.
Sure.
So we kind of talked a little bit about how you came to join, and how you ended up. How did you end up? I mean, you could have gone a lot of different ways in the
Right.
Navy. How did you end up with the A6?
Of course, as I said earlier, I was in the A3s as a bombardier navigator, and in my years at Sanford, I managed to do pretty well, and I was one of the top bombardier navigators in Sanford. And this gave me quite a good step up the ladder. So when I came up for shore duty, they called me in and said, "Hey, Ted, we're going to send you up to VA-42 to bring the A2F at the time in the old designations. A stood for attack, F stood for Grumman aircraft, and 2 was the second attack aircraft being built by Grumman, second type. So anyway, they're going to send me up to the A2F to bring the A2F into the fleet. So I gladly accepted that job. Reported into NES Oceana in February of 1963. And I spent the next 3 years in VA-42 being trained and in turn training the initial squadrons to be inducted into the fleet.
So, were you kind of the pioneer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there are 12 crews, 12 bombardiers and 12 navigators. Bombardiers all out of A3s, and 12 pilots all out of A4s. And they combined us in VA-42, and we had no idea what crew concept was. I did, because I had flown in a crew, but the A4 pilots didn't so much, but they readily accepted us. And the A6 became, what eventually became the A6, became quite an excellent demonstration of crew concept. The pilot and the BN only flew about 6 inches apart, and in side-by-side seating in the aircraft, and communication was very close between us. And oftentimes it was reduced. We didn't use ICS. It was just, we knew. It was just hand signals. We knew what had to be done, and went ahead and did it. And the crew concept, I think, was really born out of this, and carried on into the airlines eventually.
So, just real quick about the A6.
Mm-hmm.
What was so special about it? What made it unique in their?
Well, the A6 was the first aircraft ever designed. It came out as a result of the Korean War, when the Koreans were moving supplies and stuff around by night, and we had no night bombing capabilities, except to go over and drop some flares and try to find them, and drop bombs by flare lights of flares, flare light. Well, the Navy said we'll go a step farther. So they put out a request for proposals, and Grumman won the bid, and designed the A6. An ugly airplane, but one that you really grew to love. And so did the rest of the services, because it became an excellent close air support aircraft, although it didn't have any guns. But we could get right down in the dirt and do close air support for the people in South Vietnam mostly. And in Vietnam, we did about 80% of our work at night. It had 2 radars. It had a search radar, and then when you found the target and came in close, it had a track radar, which you were supposed to be able to turn on, and it was able to precisely track the target and figure out your bombing solution. Well, it didn't work quite well, because on some targets like bridges, what it did was seek the electronic center of the target. And when you got on a bridge, the electronic center kept moving as you came in, kept moving away, so eventually the track radar would end up out in infinity somewhere. So you turn it off and go back to search radar and use the search radar as the bombing instrument. But anyway, back to your original question. It was the first aircraft developed in any military inventory, including the Israelis, the Brits, or anybody else, to be solely designed for night interdiction work.
What was your do you remember your first mission, wartime mission?
Oh, well, yeah. I flew with Bill Westerman, and we, I don't know, I wasn't very nice to Jan, my wife at the time, but I mean, I don't mean it that way, but let me tell the story. On Christmas Day in 1965, we were, not Christmas Day, about a week before Christmas, we were decorating the Christmas tree, and all of a sudden, Commander Swiss Sneed, who is a skipper of BA-42, called up. He said, "Hey, Ted, BA-85 just lost an aircraft yesterday, and they need a new aircraft and a new crew. They lost the crew also." It was Ed Goldman and so anyway, he said, "Would you like to go?" I said, "Hell yes, send me, I'm ready." And hung up the phone, and Jan says, "Who's that?" And I says, "Hey, it was Swiss Sneed. Guess what, I'm going to Vietnam." Well, that was the wrong way to put it. And she broke out in tears, and of course, then I realized what I had done. And so we just kind of talked about it. And I said, "I'm going to have to go sometime anyway, so might as well do it right now." So Bill Westerman and I flew the plane over and landed over there, and they crewed us up as a crew. So we flew our first mission. I had flown a lot with Westerman in the RAG. And my first mission was against a target in Cape Moi in North Vietnam, just on the coast. We never got any fire or anything, but that was our break-in. And that was our first mission, nighttime.
I'm sorry, you said a power, what was the target?
Cape Duong, I think, was the target. Cap Duong.
Okay. Is that a base?
It was a munition storage site.
Okay. So, what was the typical day like during the war on a carrier when you're stationed off the coast? What was the typical day when you got you had the briefing, the planning? Can you describe it?
Yeah, well, there were sometimes 4 carriers on station in the Gulf of Tonkin, but most of the time there were 3. And we just kind of rotated around, but I flew missions most every day. Some days were down south in South Vietnam, and probably about 15% of our missions, and the rest of them were up in North Vietnam. The day was not really a day as you think of a day, because we flew at night a lot, so we would sleep during the day or do some mission planning, training, ground training and whatnot. And then plan our mission, brief, fly the mission, usually land about 2 or 3 in the morning back on the carrier. And there are times when they would cancel complete flight schedule, especially when we were on the night schedule. So they would cycle it around the carrier. So one carrier was at rest. The next carrier was doing day cycles, and the next carrier was doing night cycles. Well, we were the only carrier over there with A6s, and the carriers doing night cycles said, "Why are we doing night cycles when you got A6s?" So we essentially did a lot of the night cycles in the Kitty Hawk. And the day was a little inverted, a little reversed, but we got good support from the ship, and they kept the wardrooms open for us so we could eat breakfast at 8 o'clock at night, 7 o'clock at night, dinner in the morning, and then we'd sleep for a while, and then get up and do as a naval officer, aviator, you not only fly, but you also have a job as usually everyone has a division, which is a crew of men, like the mechanics or the aviation electronic people or the electrical people, whatnot. I have about 20 to 30 men, and as a junior officer, you had a division. So you had to go down and visit the division and see how the boys were doing. Check out that everything was okay with them, they were being treated right, and there was no problem with that on Kitty Hawk. But you also had to write their evaluations and just, in general, see to their well-being. So you had to do that in addition. And then I was also the Bombardier Navigator Training Officer for the squadron. So about 3 or 4 times a week I would hold ground training for the Bombardiers. And that was about the extent of our day.
Did you have any downtime ever, or?
Yes, yeah. We got rest periods, probably fly for about 4 or 5 days and then take a 24-hour break while the other carriers took up the jobs. And then go back to flying again. But we were at sea. Usually the line period consisted of 6 weeks. So we were at a line period in combat for 6 weeks, and then we got a break and usually went into QB Point in the Philippines and spent maybe a week or 10 days there. But we get a break sometimes and get up to Hong Kong, Singapore, and some other exotic ports over there, and then back to the line again. So it was, even though we lost those airplanes, we lost a lot of airplanes because it was just inexperience on the part of everybody. First of all, the A6 was rushed into combat so quickly. Excuse me. Yeah, thank you. Excuse me.
Sorry.
The A6 was rushed back into combat so quickly that, or rushed into combat, I should say. It was a brand new airplane, and from the induction in the fleet in '63, it only had 2 years before it made its first deployment, VA-75 in 1965. The test and evaluation squadrons did not have a chance to work it out, and as they should do with all the other, work out combat maneuvers, combat training, and so on. The A6 never had any of that because of, again, the rapid induction into the fleet and into combat. So what we developed our own tactics as we went on in combat and tried new training methods, two new bombing methods and several different things, and also bombing formations. The standard bombing formation up to this time was just string in, and we usually went 4-plane sections, and the number 1 lead plane usually got by pretty well, but that just woke them up, and the number 4 plane usually got pretty badly shot up. And we went through a lot of losses. Inexperience of the crews flying at 450, 500 knots at 400 feet, 200 feet. Just a little jar of the stick is enough to kill the airplane. And there are a lot of distractions. Flak, missiles flying all over the place, and the missile launch at night is almost like Cape Canaveral. And it would jar your attention away like this. You couldn't help but look at it, and maybe a little jar on the stick, and that was it. You were in the ground. So we lost a lot of airplanes, but we learned as we went along. And
can I lead you into what you were awarded the Silver Star for?
Oh, sure.
You were talking about bombing tactics.
Yeah. The bombing tactics we used, as I said, were streaming targets, and that didn't work out very well because, as I said, number 4, 3 and 4 really got shot up pretty bad. So I was thinking one night, I was laying in bed in my stateroom about this, and then I realized that the A6 I realized that the A6 had a capability nobody else had and ever had, and that was reading out the range very accurately to the target because it's based on radar. And so I got to thinking about it, and I said, hey, why don't we take off under MCON conditions, no radio communications whatsoever, and just independently, not join up or anything, just independently go out, and then we'll come at the target from 4 different cardinal directions, one from the east, one from the west, north, and south. And we were able to coordinate because we had the accuracy to the target, see the target, we had the range to the target readout, and so I drew a 5-mile circle and a 10-mile circle around the target. And we tried to program each flight so they arrived at the 10-mile circle at the same time. Well, it was hard to do with precision, so I made a rule. The first one to hit the 10-mile circle would click the radio twice. That made everybody else realize they probably had to come up on the power a little bit to get in there. And then when the first one to hit the 5-mile circle clicked once on the, we never broadcast, just the clicks. And then that click, if everybody else was there, it was okay. Everybody would click back, and then because we're coming in at different altitudes, at 4 different altitudes, we would go ahead and release, and the release was usually about 2 or 3 miles from the target. It took the bomb that long to travel over the ground to get to the target. So we all would release at the same time, and then everybody would go into a 90-degree break, right break, and pull off the target. And it sounds hairy, but if everybody did it right, it was no problem. And it worked very well. It worked to confuse the gunners and the missileers on the ground, and it just broke everything up and put us back on separate paths back to the ship, and it worked well.
And you flew the first plane.
Yeah.
So it's essentially dropping all the bombs at the same time.
Now we would travel in with, we were capable of carrying, Mark 28 Mark 82s, which were 500-pound bombs, and 15 Mark 83s, 1,000-pounders, and 5 Mark 84 2,000-pounders. So anyway, we did that. And do you want to wait until that's done?
Okay.
So we did that, and we were all carrying Mark 84, Mark 82, 500-pounders, and the target was the Tainui steel plant. And I'm not sure if we were the first ones to hit it. I think the Air Force went up during the daytime several times, but they had lousy cloud coverage. And we were in Hong Kong at the time, and got called back to the ship, skipper and myself, and they cleared the A6 to go in nighttime. And we said, oh boy. So we had to stay on the ship and plan and work out our plans, and that's what we did.
Wow.
So when we got back online, the first night back online, we went ahead and performed the mission. It worked out very well.
Let me ask you, I'm sure there are a lot of them, but what was your scariest moment in combat?
Well, I don't know. That's hard to define. One time we were on a daylight run against a truck park, for crying out loud. 28 airplanes going against a truck park. But that's what McNamara and Johnson said to do, so we did it. But got hit just 85 millimeter went off right in front of the aircraft, completely crazed by canopy, and I could not see out of the canopy in front. And then a couple of missile fragments, shell fragments, broke through the canopy and were whizzing around in the cockpit. And one went through my sleeve and my flight suit, and another creased my hard hat. Neither one of us got hit or hurt, but it knocked out a lot of the electronics in there. And so I lost the radar, we lost communication, we lost our radios. I kept my radar, but the rest of the system was shot out. The aircraft had what's called digital integrated navigation bombing equipment. And it took all the track radar, the search radar, the INS, all into one central computer and just mashed it all together to come up with solutions to your navigation and bombing problems. And that all got knocked out. So we were heading back to the ship, and we had also taken, I think it was a 35 millimeter in the wing that went completely through the wing. And so we were leaking fuel, siphoning fuel out of the top of the wing tank, losing a lot of fuel. So we're heading back, no radio, no way of communicating with anybody. We got separated from the rest of the flight and heading back to the ship. And fortunately, the radar was still working. I was able to identify the 3 carriers, and they're all steaming in formation for recovery, all heading into the wind, so they're all on the same course. They had about 3 or 4 miles separation between the ships. And I just picked out the lead ship. I didn't know whether it was ours or not because we couldn't even tank. We were losing so much fuel, we couldn't take the time to tank. And headed back to the ship, and they had written us off as lost. And we showed up. We didn't have enough to make the standard overhead brake. We started in on a straight and no radio. Fortunately, the air boss saw us, and he lifted the rest of the landing pattern up into what's called the dog pattern. So clear the way for us. And the skipper, I flew with Ron Hayes, the skipper, put down the flaps, and the left flap went down, but the right flap, it turned out that the hit we had taken in the wing also broke the screw jack for the flap. So it stayed up. This flap went down, this flap stayed up, so the plane rolled as we were coming down on final. And the skipper just pulled the flaps back up, rolled the plane out steady, and 3 seconds later we hit the deck and recovered. We didn't even have time enough to be scared. But I was scared after that. But I think that was the only time an A6 ever made a flap-up landing on a carrier. I'm not sure, but I think it is.
He must have been a good pilot.
He was a great pilot. He was a super guy. Yeah, we got together well as a crew.
Yeah. Cool. I'm going to kind of wrap up this section.
Okay.
Do you think you talked about anything you want to talk about during the service years?
Well, I made 2 cruises as a bombardier navigator in A3s on Saratoga. And then I made the cruise on the missile crisis on Independence. Then I went into the A6 and made 2 cruises on Kitty Hawk to Vietnam. And then I made another cruise in VA-34 to the Med on Kennedy. So I deployed on quite a few of the ships and in the squadrons. And then I ended up as a fleet indoctrination officer for the Tomahawk and the Fleet Intelligence Center, and also doing all the Navy PSYOP targeting. It was a great career, and I loved it.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, well, we're going to take a quick break, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about like post-war stuff.
Sure.
So,